Welcome to this tutorial everybody, and in this video I'm going to be talking about how you can use slow shutter speeds for photographing birds in flight. For most of us, when we set up to photograph birds in flight, we're probably going to opt for a fast shutter speed, and I know I still do that. That's going to make it much easier to stop the movement of the flying bird, and it's going to eliminate all or most camera shake. So why would we want to use a slow shutter speed? What is the point? Well, by slowing the shutter speed down, we really change the look of the image. Rather than just freezing that one moment in time, we're actually going to deliberately blur the image to some extent, and we're going to do that to show the movement. So it's going to show the movement more, and it's going to add a bit more drama. Need a camera for this bit. Okay, so what I'm really talking about here is panning. So what do I mean by that? It pretty much means that you'll side onto the bird and you're going to be following the bird as it's flying across in front of you. Now, what we need to do with the slower shutter speed is we need to try and match the speed of the bird as much as possible. So if we can track the bird as it flies past, if we can pan with our camera lens at the same speed the bird is flying, and that's going to get the best images. So what's going to happen then is, if we do it well enough, then the bird is still going to be relatively sharp, or the body and the head of the bird hopefully is going to be relatively sharp because you're matching the speed of the bird, but everything else is going to have some degree of blur to it. This is going to depend on your shutter speed. So once you slow the shutter speed down, you're going to get blur in the wings, because usually the wings are moving pretty fast, so you're going to get some blur in that, but you're also going to get some blur in the background, and both of those things are really going to help to show up the movement. Bear in mind, if the bird's flying towards you, this isn't really going to work because the background's going to stay the same and the speed of the bird is going to be changing. Now, what shutter speed should you use? Well, this is the fun bit really. This is where it gets creative. You know, it's your image and it's how you want it to look. This is the creative part of this type of photography. So what I would say, just as a bit of advice, is to try going down to at least 1/200th, maybe between 1/200th and 1/100th of a second shutter speed, because then you're going to see some noticeable difference compared to a really fast shutter speed. And then beyond that, really, you can just make it slower and vary the effect and see what you like. So you could go down to 1/60th, 1/30th, even as low as 1/15th. Now if you go below that, I think the effect starts to get really, really extreme, and maybe it's a bit too much, but again, it all depends on personal taste. I do think in a lot of situations, working around 1/60th of a second tends to give really nice results. Now, having said all that, it really depends on so many different factors. So you need to think about how far away you are from the bird, how fast the bird is flying, maybe how quickly the wings are beating, because if it's gliding, you're not going to get much movement in the wings at all, if any. All those things are going to depend on what is the best shutter speed for the effects that you're after. Now, when you're doing this, something that you really need to do, which you should do with all types of bird in flight photography, is to really try your best to match the speed of the bird. That is crucial to get the best results. In terms of camera support, I don't think it's always that necessary because you're kind of following at the same speed. I think it sort of cancels some of the camera shake out to a degree. If you are using very slow shutter speeds, then it might be better to use a tripod, certainly with a bigger lens. And if you've got image stabilization, then good idea to switch that on. I don't have it on this lens, but I do on my bigger one. If you do use the image stabilization, then I would put it onto the number 2 setting, which is more set up for panning movement. I don't know if I've noticed too much difference, but that is what the manufacturers would generally suggest, is for panning, put it onto mode 2. We can get some really lovely effects in the background, all those streaks which just really add to that feeling of movement. Well, bear in mind that you need something in the background in order to do that. So if you're photographing on a clear cloudy sky, a clear blue sky, then it's simply not going to happen. However, you are still going to be able to get the movement in the bird's wings. So this video is largely about panning, where we're following the bird that's flying across in front of us. But there are other situations where you could still slow the shutter speed down for slightly different results. One of those is where a bird is, say, coming into land, or maybe it's changing direction. It's not going super fast. If we slow the shutter speed down a little bit, then we can still get really pin-sharp head, maybe some of the body nice and sharp, but the wings will have some blur to them. Sometimes it might literally just be the wingtips have a little bit of blur, or it might be more of the wings. So in that case, I would say a good shutter speed to aim for is about 1/400th, maybe 1/400th, 1/320th, so slower than what you probably use most of the time for birds in flight, and that's just going to give that little bit of blur in certain areas. Another really good situation and one to experiment with is birds hovering. So if you think about birds hovering, their head is already staying very still, but the wings are moving. So you can do some really good stuff with this. Here's a shot I took of a black-headed gull, and this one is taken at 1/80th of a second. So my plan here was to try and get the head relatively sharp. It's not pin sharp, but it's pretty close. But I wanted to really blur the wings. I didn't want to do it too excessively. So here I've gone for 1/80th, and that's given quite a nice wing blur. Here I've taken it much more to the extreme, and I've used a shutter speed of 1/15th of a second, and that's just really recorded all that movement of all the downbeat, the upbeat, and I just love the effect of this movement. It's something I definitely want to do more. There is another benefit to using slower shutter speeds, and that is that you can use a lower ISO. So if you're struggling with your equipment and maybe you're pushing the ISO higher and you're just getting grainier images and you're just not happy with the results, then consider using a slower shutter speed, because that's going to allow you to use a lower ISO and get cleaner images. So if you're someone who's often shooting at 1/1000th of a second, try shooting at 1/500th. If you often shoot at 1/500th, try shooting at 1/250th of a second. Just slow it down a little bit and you can lower the ISO for better images. What exposure mode is best to use for this, and when do we do this type of photography? Well, for me personally, I just like to use manual as much as possible because it gives me complete control over everything, including the shutter speed. Now, if you're not as confident or you're a beginner, I would suggest that you try using shutter priority. That's probably TV on your camera. So the reason for this is if you use shutter priority, then you can actually select the shutter speed that you want to work with, and the camera is going to automatically change the aperture to give you the correct exposure. Now you could also do this with auto ISO. If you're more confident, you could use manual. But for beginners, I would suggest shutter priority with automatic ISO. Good times to do this photography is just really where the light levels are lower. So if it's a very sunny day, then early in the morning or in the evening it's going to work well. Alternatively, a cloudy, overcast day is perfect because again your light levels are going to be lower and the shutter speed is naturally going to be slower already, so it makes it easier to do this type of technique. So particularly on those overcast days, if it just looks really dull, uninspiring for birds in flight photography, then try not to think like that. Try to think, I'm going to use this as an opportunity. I'm going to use those naturally slower shutter speeds just to do something a bit different and a bit more creative. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider subscribing to Paul Miguel Photography. It's me there, my posh polo shirt. And even better, if you could share the video with other people you think would be interested, would benefit, that really helps my channel. Alright, I'll see you again in the next tutorial sometime soon.